6:48 a.m., and the first thing I saw through the frost on my window was and Oppos. The sunrise. It was the rhythmic, clinical flash of red and blue light dancing across the mist of Blackwood Ridge. And let me tell you, there's a specific kind of silence that's settling over a gravel driveway before a house fire ignites. A silence I've known for 22 years as a battalion chief. But this morning, the only thing burning was my patience. I stepped out onto the porch, barefoot and shivering in a faded Oklahoma City Fire Department sweatshirt that seen more soot than a chimney sweep, holding a mug of black coffee like it was the only thing keeping the world on its axis. And there she was, Vivian Sterling, the self-appointed queen of the Blackwood Ridge Homeowners Association, standing there in a cream-colored trench coat with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, pointing a manicured finger at my front door, while two young officers looked on with that weary expression of men who had better things to do than referee a suburban border war. Vivian didn't even wait for me to clear the steps before she let out this shrill, piercing cry that cut right through the morning fog, shouting that I was a squatter, a trespasser on HOA-protected green space, and that my, quote, unauthorized presence, quote, was a blight on the community and Oppos' aesthetic integrity. A blight, she called me, as if 20 years of pulling people out of burning sedans and collapsed attics could be erased by a woman who spends her weekends measuring the exact height of her neighbors in Oppos, Kentucky bluegrass. The younger cop, a kid who looked like he'd started shaving about 20 minutes ago, looked at me and asked if I had a lease or a permit to be on this lot. And I just stood there for a second, feeling the steam from my coffee hit my face, smelling the sharp, chemical tang of patrol car exhaust mixing with the sweet scent of the cedar trees I'd spent all spring planting. I told him, quote, officer, if I'm trespassing, then I've been breaking the law every single morning for the last 8 months, quote. And I reached over to the weathered wooden table on my porch, grabbing the heavy leather folder that stays right by the door, because when you spend a lifetime running into buildings that everyone else is running out of, you learn to keep your exit strategy and your paperwork in the same place. I handed him the deed, the one with the fresh county clerk's stamp and the gold seal that glimmered in the early light, and I watched his eyes track the parcel numbers, then look at Vivian, then back at me. While her confidence started to crack just a tiny bit, a hairline fracture in the porcelain mask of a woman who thought she ruled everything the light touched. I didn't oppose, say a word, just watched as the senior officer exhaled a cloud of cold air and muttered, quote, mon oppose. We in Oppos. We're going to need to verify this because this man ISN into Oppos. TA squatter. He in Oppos. S the owner of record, quote. And in that moment, I realized Vivian Sterling didn't into Oppos. T just hate my gravel driveway or my rusted out workshop. She genuinely didn't into Oppos. T realized that the land she'd spent months trying to annex into her little suburban empire was never hers to begin with. And that was the exact moment the match was struck. My name is Silas Vance, and after 2 decades of Oklahoma sirens and the kind of adrenaline that rots your teeth, I just wanted a place where the only thing I had to listen to was the wind through the oaks and the occasional creak of an old barn. My wife, Sarah, had passed away 4 years ago, and the city just felt too loud, too crowded with memories that didn't into Oppos to have enough room to breathe. So I took my pension and my grief, and I bought a 5-acre, quote, island, quote, of unincorporated land that happened to be bordered on 3 sides by the pristine, gated perfection of Blackwood Ridge. It was an old homestead, a bit ragged around the edges, with a barn that leaned slightly to the left and a driveway made of crushed river stone. And for the first month, it felt like oxygen after a lifetime of smoke until that first white envelope arrived. Welcome to Blackwood Ridge, it said in embossed silver script, followed by 42 pages of rules about what color my front door could be and how many minutes I was allowed to leave my garage door open before it became a, quote, security risk. And, quote, I sent a very polite, very professional email back saying, quote, thanks, but I'm not in your HOA, quote, thinking that would be the end of it. But in places like this, people like Vivian Sterling Dawn and Oppos, take, quote, no, quote. For an answer, they take it as a personal declaration of war, and before I knew it, a silver Mercedes SUV started crawling past my gate twice a day. Tinted windows rolled down, just enough for a smartphone lens to peek through, capturing images of my, non-compliant, life. The letters started getting nastier, moving from, friendly reminders, to, final notices of violation, for things that were literally none of their business, like the fact that I liked to work on my 1978 Ford F-150 in the shade of my own barn, or that I had an Oppos T-pin in my workshop to match the, sandstone beige, palette of the neighboring cul-de-sac. Vivian actually showed up on my property one afternoon while I was mid-weld, sparks flying everywhere, and she didn't Oppos to even say hello. She just stood there with her clipboard and told me that my structure was an eyesore that was, dragging down the collective equity, of the ridge. I lifted my mask, wiped the soot from my forehead, and told her, Vivian, you're standing on my grass, and unless you're here to help me seat this gasket, I suggest you take your collective equity and walk it back across the property line, And the look she gave me, it wasn't Oppos, just anger. It was this deep, vibrating indignation that someone dared to exist outside of her checklist. She told me I'd be hearing from their legal counsel, and I just laughed because after you and Oppos, V stared down a backdraft in a warehouse fire. A letter from a suburban lawyer feels about as threatening as a wet napkin, but I didn't end Oppos. T realized then just how far a person obsessed with control will go to protect their illusion of power. By the second month, the neighborhood started treating me like a ghost or a pariah. People at the local grocer would see my Blackwood Ridgegate pass, which I only had because the county road required me to pass through their entrance, and they'd turn their carts the other way, whispering about the, non-payer, or the, squatter, who was ruining the view. I started feeling that old tightness in my chest, the 3 a.m. alarm reflex, and I knew I had to stop playing defense, so I spread out the official county plat maps on my kitchen table and compared them to the, community map, on the Blackwood Ridge website, and that's when I saw the fraud in plain black and white. Vivian hadn't into Oppos. T just made a mistake. She had deliberately shaded my 5 acres in, community green, labeling it as a, future park and drainage easement, to justify their attempt to seize it, and it was a calculated, cold-blooded expansion, a paper fire designed to swallow my home before I even knew it was burning. I've seen enough smoke to know when someone's about to light a match. So I called in a favor from a woman named Elena, a high-powered real estate attorney whose mother I'd dragged out of a burning duplex 12 years ago. And when she saw the maps, she didn't in Oppos. T just get angry. She got that clinical, shark-like grin that lawyers get when they smell blood in the water. Elena and I spent weeks digging through the HOA's filings, and what we found was a house of cards held together by Vivian's ego and a lot of creative accounting. Because it turns out that while she was busy fining people $500 for having the wrong kind of mulch, she was also, consulting, for the HOA through a shell company called Sterling Lux Management. We found 3 separate payments totaling over $140,000 for, aesthetic harmony surveys, and, landscape oversight, that were nothing more than a direct pipeline from the neighbors in Oppos, dues into Vivian's personal bank account. And on top of that, the HOA had taken out a massive, interest-only loan to build a clubhouse that they couldn't into Oppos actually afford. They were sitting on a debt cliff, a $1.2 million balloon payment that was due in 90 days, and Vivian's plan was to annex my land, rezone it, and sell it off to a developer to cover the hole she dug, which meant this wasn't Oppos. Just about a gravel driveway. It was a fight for the very ground I stood on, and I decided right then that if she wanted to play with fire, I'd show her how a professional handles a blaze. The harassment didn't in Oppos. Stopped while we were building our case. In fact, it got worse, with Vivian sending an anonymous code enforcement complaint about, unpermitted structures, that forced me to host county inspectors 3 times in 10 days. And when they found nothing wrong, she shifted to a smear campaign that would have made a politician blush. I'd wake up to find flyers taped to my mailbox with my face on them, calling me a, danger to the community, And one night someone, I'm not saying it was her, but the air smelled like her expensive lilac perfume, poured a gallon of industrial white primer over the hood of my truck. I stood there in the moonlight, looking at the dripping paint, and I didn't in Oppos. TL, I didn't in Oppos. To even get mad, I just took a photo, sent it to Elena, and went back to sleep because the firefighter in me knows that you dawn in Oppos. T fight a fire by screaming at the flames. You fight it by cutting off the oxygen. Elena filed for discovery, and when the judge granted us access to the HOA's bank records, the whole end quote. Community harmony end quote. Facade started to melt like wax, revealing a pattern of intimidation, selective enforcement, and outright theft that had been going on for years, affecting people like the Miller family, who were being foreclosed on over a $7,000 fine for a treehouse, and Mrs. Gable, an 80-year-old widow who was being sued for, end quote, encroaching, end quote, on a common strip that didn't and. Oppos to even exist on the legal maps. The real bombshell dropped when we looked at the fine print of that $1.2 million loan, because there was a clause, a tiny, almost invisible paragraph, that stated in the event of a default, the lender didn't and Oppos. Just get the clubhouse they got, end quote, all attached privileges of governance and common assets, end quote, meaning whoever held that debt held the HOA itself. I looked at Elena across a pile of bank statements and said, end quote, what if the bank doesn't end Oppos? Do you want to wait 90 days? What if someone buys that debt right now? End quote. And she just stared at me, her eyes widening as the pieces fell into place. And within 48 hours, I was on the phone with my brother, a venture capitalist in Dallas who loves a good fight almost as much as I do. He helped me set up a private equity entity, and we approached the bank with a cash offer to buy the distressed note at a discount. And 3 weeks later, I wasn't in Oppos. Just the guy with the end quote, illegal end quote, gravel driveway anymore. I was the primary creditor for the Blackwood Ridge Homeowners Association, which is a very fancy way of saying I was officially Vivian Sterling's landlord. The day the foreclosure notice was tacked to the clubhouse door was a Tuesday, a beautiful, sunny afternoon where the air smelled like rain and justice, and I walked up there with my leather folder and a stapler, watching as Vivian pulled up in a Mercedes, her face going from porcelain white to a deep, bruised purple as she read the words in quote, public auction in quote, and in quote, default, in quote. She marched up to me, her voice trembling with this frantic, high-pitched rage, screaming that I couldn't and Oppos to do this, that the neighborhood belonged to her, that she had built this empire, and I just stood there, leaning against the pillars of the clubhouse she'd stolen from her neighbors, and I said, in quote, Vivian, you didn't in Oppos. Build an empire, you build a cage, and you forgot to check who held the keys, end quote. The look in her eyes was and Oppos. Just anger anymore. It was the raw, naked terror of a bully who realizes the playground has shifted under her feet, and as the neighbors started to gather, drawn out by the shouting, I didn't end Oppos. See a crowd of enemies. I saw a group of people who had been held hostage by a clipboard and a trench coat for far too long. The auction was a formality, really, because nobody else was going to touch a toxic HOA debt with a 10-foot pole. So I bought the common areas, the clubhouse, and the end quote, governing privileges end quote, for the remaining balance of the loan, and my first act as the new end quote, owner end quote. A Blackwood Ridge was to call an emergency meeting in the very clubhouse Vivian had used as her throne room. She tried to bar the door, claiming I didn't end Oppos. Have the authority, but the sheriff's deputy I'd brought along, the same one who had verified my deed months earlier, just shook his head and stepped aside, letting me into the room where 60 terrified homeowners were waiting to see if their lives were about to get even worse. I walked up to the podium, looking out at the faces of people who had shunned me, and I didn't in Oppos. To give a speech, I just held up a single piece of paper, the new charter for the Blackwood Ridge Land Trust, and I told them that as of 5 p.m. today, the HOA was officially dissolved, the fines were forgiven, the liens were canceled, and the land was being turned back over to them, to be managed by a board of volunteers with no power to fine anyone for the color of their mulch. The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum, and then it just erupted, not into chaos, but into this collective, sobbing exhale of relief, with people like Mr. Miller and Mrs. Gable coming up to me with tears in their eyes, clutching their own folders of, end quote, violations, end quote, that were now nothing more than scrap paper. Vivian tried to make one last stand, shouting about, end quote, statutes, end quote, and, end quote, bylaws, end quote, from the back of the room, But her own attorney was already packing his briefcase, realizing that his client wasn't an Oppos, the president anymore. She was just a woman with a very expensive car and a very long list of criminal embezzlement charges coming her way. See, the County Financial Crimes Unit had been watching our discovery process, and as Vivian walked out toward the parking lot, two detectives were waiting by her Mercedes with a set of handcuffs that clicked with a finality that no clipboard could ever match. And as they led her away, the only thing left in the air was the faint, fading scent of lilacs and the sound of neighbors actually talking to each other for the first time in a decade. It's been 6 months since that day, and Blackwood Ridge finally feels like a neighborhood instead of a prison camp. The end quote. Sandstone beige end quote. Houses are starting to sprout blue and green doors. The end quote. Illegal end quote. Tree houses are full of kids, and every Tuesday, we have a community barbecue at the clubhouse where the only rule is that you have to bring a side dish. My barn still leans to the left, my truck still has a faint ghost of that white primer on the hood, and I still drink my coffee on the porch every morning, but now when people drive by, they don an Oppos, roll up their windows and hide, they wave, and sometimes they stop to help me weld, because it turns out that when you stop trying to control people, they actually start acting like a community. I came here looking for peace, and I found it, but I had to burn down a tyranny of paperwork to get there. And it taught me that the most dangerous fire isn't an Oppos. The one that burns wood. In Oppos. That's the one that burns through human dignity. But hey, that in Oppos. That's just my story. And I know there are thousands of Vivians out there with clipboards and a hunger for power, so I have to ask you. If your neighbor called the cops on you for standing in your own driveway, how far would you go to protect your home? Would you play by their rules, or would you find a fine print and strike the match yourself? Drop a comment below. Let me know if you think I went too far or if justice was finally served, because in a world full of HOAs, sometimes you have to be the one who brings the extinguisher or the one who buys the whole firehouse.